The Aegean Sea does not give up its secrets easily. For 2,000 years, the Roman grain ship lay in the crushing silence of the seafloor off the coast of Antikythera, entombed in coral and silt. It was a graveyard of marble statues and amphorae until 1900, when a group of sponge divers stumbled upon the wreckage. Among the armless heroes of stone and rotting wood, they found a lump of green, calcified corrosion that looked like nothing more than a discarded rock. They called it Fragment G. For decades, the fragment sat in a museum basement, ignored. It was ugly, brittle, and seemingly worthless. But as the bronze dried and cracked, a glint of precision emerged from the decay. Elias Thorne, a modern-day historian obsessed with the impossible, stood before the glass casing in the present day, his breath hitching. He wasn't looking at a rock. He was looking at a gear. Not a crude, hand-hammered wheel, but a triangular-toothed cog of such mathematical perfection that it defied the known timeline of human genius. "It shouldn't be here," Elias whispered to the empty gallery. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent his life chasing ghosts. The history books said the Greeks had art and philosophy, but they didn't have this. They didn't have differential gearing. They didn't have the technology to shrink the heavens into a box the size of a shoelace. Yet, as the first X-ray scans flickered onto his laptop screen, the truth screamed back at him. Inside the corrosion lay 30 separate gears, an interlocking web of bronze that calculated the cycles of the moon, the positions of the planets, and the timing of the Olympic Games with a precision that wouldn't be seen again for 1,500 years. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. If this existed in 150 BC, then everything we knew about the rise and fall of civilization was a lie. We didn't climb a steady ladder of progress. We fell off a cliff and spent a millennium wandering in the dark, forgetting that we once held the stars in our hands. Elias began to notice something the previous researchers had missed. Hidden beneath a layer of calcium was a series of inscriptions, not just instructions for use, but a warning. The text spoke of a great weaver, a mind that saw time not as a flow, but as a machine that could be manipulated. As Elias delved deeper into the schematics, the room seemed to grow colder. The device wasn't just a calendar. It was a predictive engine. It tracked the Saros cycle, an 18-year period of eclipses, but it did so with a terrifying addition. There was a dial on the back, barely visible in the scans, that didn't align with any known celestial body. It was a countdown. To what, Elias didn't know, but the math was flawless. The gear teeth were cut to a ratio that matched the precession of the equinoxes, a concept the Greeks supposedly hadn't mastered. He stayed in the museum until the security guards forced him out, his mind racing with the implications. If the Antikythera mechanism was the first computer, who was the programmer? The legend spoke of Archimedes, the man who moved the world, but this felt older, more primal. It felt like a message sent across the ocean of time, a desperate attempt to preserve a logic that the world was about to burn. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He saw the gears turning behind his eyelids, the bronze teeth grinding against the centuries. He realized that the device wasn't broken by the shipwreck, it was finished. It had done its job. But the countdown on that final, hidden dial was still ticking. In his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of ancient Greek translations, Elias felt a sudden, irrational fear. The ancient computer wasn't a relic of the past. It was a blueprint for a future that had been stolen from us. And as he stared at the blurred X-ray of the final gear, he saw a name etched into the metal, a name that didn't belong in any history book. It was his own. The discovery of his own name, or at least a phonetic archaic version of it, sent Elias into a spiral of obsession. He traveled to the ruins of Syracuse, the home of Archimedes, searching for a workshop that shouldn't exist. He wasn't looking for a forge, he was looking for a laboratory. In the dusty archives of a private monastery, he found a diary from a 12th century monk who claimed to have seen the bronze demon before it was lost to the sea. The monk described a man known only as the architect, a figure who walked the streets of Syracuse during the Roman siege, carrying a box that hummed with the sound of 1,000 bees. Elias began to piece together the life of this architect. He wasn't a god, but he was a man who had looked at the sun and saw a gear. He saw the tides as a lever and the seasons as a pulley. While his fellow citizens prayed to Zeus for rain, the architect was calculating the exact atmospheric pressure required to break a drought. He was a man out of time, a ghost in the machinery of history. Elias felt a strange kinship with him. They were both outsiders, men who looked at the world and saw the code beneath the skin of reality. In a hidden chamber beneath the limestone quarries of Syracuse, Elias found what he was looking for. It was a workshop, sealed by a rockslide 2,000 years ago. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of copper. On a stone workbench sat the discarded husks of earlier prototypes, gears made of wood, then iron, then finally, the magnificent bronze. But it wasn't the machines that caught his eye, it was the walls. They were covered in equations. Some were familiar, like the calculations for the area of a circle. Others were impossible. They were the mathematics of fluid dynamics, of electricity, of binary logic. He knew, Elias whispered, his flashlight beam trembling. He knew it all. The architect hadn't just built a calculator. He had tried to jumpstart the Industrial Revolution in the heart of the Iron Age. He had tried to give humanity the tools of the gods before they were ready to handle them. But the world had pushed back. The Roman soldiers who sacked the city didn't care for mathematics. They cared for gold and blood. The architect had watched his world burn, and in his final hours, he had realized that his knowledge was a curse. He had taken his greatest creation, the one that could predict the end of empires, and boarded a ship for Rome, hoping to hide it in the capital. But the sea had claimed it first. Elias found a small lead tablet tucked into a crevice in the wall. It was a letter, addressed to the one who follows. It spoke of a second device, a twin of the stars, that was never put on the ship. While the first machine tracked the movements of the heavens, the second tracked the movements of the soul. It was a social engine, a device designed to calculate the behavior of mobs, the rise of tyrants, and the collapse of society. The architect had realized that humans were as predictable as the planets if you had a big enough gear. The terror Elias felt was no longer about the past. It was about the present. If the second device existed, it meant that history wasn't a series of random events. It was a programmed sequence. Every war, every plague, every triumph had been calculated by a bronze machine sitting in a dark room somewhere. He realized that the countdown on the first device wasn't for an eclipse. It was for the moment the two machines would sync up, the moment when the physical world and the human world would collide in a final, inevitable gear turn. As Elias left the cavern, he felt eyes on him. The modern world felt thin, like a veil draped over an ancient, grinding engine. He was no longer just a historian, he was a glitch in the system. The architect had left him a map, not to treasure, but to the center of the clockwork. And the next stop was a place where time itself was said to stand still. The trail led Elias to the mountains of Tibet, to a remote monastery perched on the edge of a frozen abyss. According to the architect's lead tablet, the twin of the stars had been carried east by a fleeing student, hidden in the one place where the chaos of empires could not reach. The monks here didn't speak of computers. They spoke of the heartbeat of the mountain. They believed that deep within the rock, a great will turned, keeping the world in balance. The climb was brutal. The air was thin, and Elias's lungs burned with every step. He was followed by a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He wasn't alone. Men in dark suits, agents of a corporation that had been funding his research in secret, were closing in. They didn't want the history, they wanted the power. They wanted the algorithm that could predict the stock market, the elections, the very thoughts of the masses. They wanted the twin. Elias reached the monastery at sunset. The high monk, a man whose face was a map of 100 winters, led him to a heavy iron door in the floor of the main hall. "We have guarded the silence for 2,000 years, the monk said. But the silence is ending. The machine is accelerating. They descended into the dark. Below the monastery lay a cavern filled with steam and the smell of hot oil. And there, in the center of the earth, was the twin. It was massive, a tower of bronze and silver gears, 3 stories high, powered by a diverted underground hot spring. It didn't tick, it hummed. A low, vibrating frequency that Elias felt in his teeth. This was the social engine. It was a gargantuan analog computer that processed the data of humanity, birth rates, grain harvests, weather patterns, and turned them into a single, rotating output. Elias watched as a giant pendulum swung back and forth, etched with the names of nations that no longer existed. He saw the gear for the Roman Empire, now locked and still. He saw the gear for the British Empire, spinning slower and slower. And he saw a new gear, a massive, jagged wheel of chrome and glass that represented the modern world. It was spinning at a frantic, unstable speed. The architect saw the pattern, the monk explained. He realized that human greed is a constant. He built this to warn us when the friction becomes too great. When the gears heat up, the world breaks. Elias realized that the device wasn't just observing history, it was a pressure valve. The architect had hoped that by understanding the math of misery, future generations could avoid the crashes. But the machine showed that we were nearing a global seizure. The gears were grinding against each other, throwing off sparks of blue static. The countdown from the Antikythera mechanism, the one Elias had seen in the X-rays, was mirrored here on a giant, obsidian dial. It was set to reach 0 in less than 48 hours. Suddenly, the monastery doors above were kicked open. Flashlights cut through the steam. The corporate mercenaries had arrived. They didn't care about the warning. They saw only the most sophisticated analytical tool ever created. They began to set up sensors, aiming to hack the bronze. Elias stood between them and the machine, a small man against the weight of greed. "You don't understand," Elias shouted over the roar of the gears. "It's not a tool for you to use. It's a mirror. It's showing us that we're about to destroy ourselves." The lead mercenary, a man with cold, calculating eyes, pushed Elias aside. "We don't need a sermon, Doctor. We need the data. If this thing can predict the future, we're going to own it." But as they attached their digital probes to the ancient bronze, the machine reacted. The hum turned into a scream. The gears began to spin in reverse. The architect had built a failsafe. If the machine was ever tampered with by those who sought to control it rather than understand it, the social engine would trigger a reset. The ground began to shake. The heartbeat of the mountain was turning into a quake. Elias realized that the countdown wasn't for an eclipse or a war. It was for the moment humanity finally reached the limit of its own arrogance. The cavern collapsed in a roar of stone and bronze. Elias barely escaped, pulled from the rubble by the high monk as the mountain itself seemed to groan in agony. The mercenaries were gone, buried with the machine they tried to enslave. But as Elias looked out over the Himalayan peaks, he realized the damage was done. The twin had been disrupted. The heartbeat was erratic. Across the globe, the effects were felt instantly. It wasn't magic. It was the breakdown of the subtle, invisible structures that the machine had been balancing. Communication networks flickered. The global markets, already fragile, began to swing wildly as if responding to an unseen ghost. People felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of anxiety, a collective heebie-jeebies that sent millions into the streets. The friction of souls, which the architect had tried to mitigate, was now raw and burning. Elias knew there was only one way to stop the collapse. He had to return to the beginning. He had to go back to the Antikythera shipwreck. The first device, the star computer, wasn't just a calendar. It was the master clock. It was the remote control for the twin. The architect had separated them for a reason. One tracked the physical laws of the universe, the other tracked the human spirit. For the world to remain stable, the two had to be in sync. By pulling the star computer from the sea, humans had unplugged the regulator. He used his remaining funds to charter a salvage boat. The world was falling apart around him. Flights were grounded, cities were dark, but Elias was driven by a singular, frantic purpose. He reached the coordinates of the Antikythera wreck just as a massive storm began to brew. The sea was angry, reflecting the chaos of the human world. "I have to go down," Elias told the boat captain. "In this? You'll die, Thorn. If I don't, we all die anyway," Elias shouted over the wind. He donned a modern diving suit, but he felt like an ancient warrior going into battle. As he descended into the black water, the pressure mounted. The deeper he went, the more he felt the pulse. The star computer, the pieces of it still held in the museum and the pieces still buried in the silt, was calling out to its twin. On the seafloor, Elias found the ghost gear. It was a part of the mechanism that had never been recovered, a massive bronze ring half buried in the sand. When he touched it, a surge of energy threw him back. His HUD display and his helmet went haywire, flickering with ancient Greek characters and binary code. He realized the ancient computer wasn't just mechanical. It was something more. It was a biomechanical interface. It used the salt water of the ocean as a conductor and the Earth's magnetic field as a battery. He began to dig. He wasn't just looking for bronze. He was looking for the key. The architect's diary had mentioned a soul pin, a small needle of meteoric iron that connected the two machines across the dimensions of space and time. As his gloved fingers brushed against a sharp, cold object, the water around him began to glow with a soft, bioluminescent blue. He pulled the soul pin from the sand. Instantly, the images of the world's chaos flashed through his mind. The riots, the burning cities, the weeping mothers. He felt the weight of every human life, every gear turn of history. He realized the architect hadn't just been a genius. He had been a martyr. He had taken the burden of the world onto his shoulders, trying to calculate a way for us to survive ourselves. But Elias also saw the flaw. The machine could predict the patterns, but it couldn't change the human heart. It could show us the cliff, but it couldn't stop us from jumping. The soul pin began to vibrate in his hand, heat radiating through his suit. The countdown was at its final hour. He had to reunite the pin with the star computer's heart, which was now back in the museum in Athens. He had to complete the circuit. But as he swam toward the surface, a massive shadow loomed over him. The corporation hadn't given up. A submarine was waiting, its claws extended. They didn't want the world to be stable. They wanted to be the ones who owned the crash. The final hour began in a burst of bubbles and steel. The submarine's claws snapped at Elias, but the storm above was creating a chaotic current that worked in his favor. He used the soul pin like a dagger, jamming it into the sub's external sensor array. The electromagnetic discharge from the pin was blinding. The ancient technology, powered by the very core of the planet, shorted out the billion-dollar modern vessel. Elias used the distraction to swim for the surface, his lungs screaming for air. He was pulled onto the salvage boat just as the sky turned a bruised, electric purple. "Athens," he yelled. "We have to get to the museum." The journey was a nightmare. The boat barely survived the waves, and the drive through the streets of Athens was like a race through a war zone. The city was in a total blackout, illuminated only by the fires of the panicked populace. People were shouting that the world was ending, that the gods had returned to punish them. Elias knew better. It wasn't gods, it was just math. He broke into the National Archaeological Museum, the soul pin glowing like a fallen star in his hand. The guards had fled. He ran through the halls of marble statues, their blank eyes watching him pass. He reached the room where the fragments of the Antikythera mechanism were kept. In the darkness, the bronze pieces were humming, vibrating in harmony with the pin. Elias smashed the glass of the display case. He didn't care about protocol anymore. He took the main fragment, the one with the hidden countdown dial, and held it against the soul pin. The moment they touched, the museum was flooded with light. Not the light of a fire, but the light of pure information. Elias saw the entire history of the world laid out like a giant, interconnected web of gears. He saw how every action led to a reaction. He saw the architect standing in a sun-drenched courtyard in Syracuse, looking forward through time at him. The architect smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "The choice is yours," a voice echoed in Elias's mind, a voice that sounded like grinding metal and whispering wind. "The machine can hold the world together, or it can let it go. Do you want the comfort of the clockwork, or the terror of the truth?" Elias looked at the countdown. 10 seconds. He realized that the global seizure wasn't a death sentence. It was a birth. The machine had been keeping us in a state of controlled growth, preventing us from failing so we could never truly learn. It was a planetary training wheel. If he completed the circuit, the world would return to its balanced state, safe, predictable, but stagnant. If he let the countdown hit 0 without the pin, the machine would shatter, and humanity would be truly free for the first time in 2 millennia. We would be responsible for our own chaos, our own joy, and our own end. 5 seconds. He thought of the beauty of the gears, the genius of the architect. He thought of the safety of a world where everything made sense. Then he thought of the fires in the streets, the unpredictability of a human hug, the messy, uncalculated glory of a life without a blueprint. 4, 3, 2. Elias pulled the soul pin away. He didn't complete the circuit. Instead, he threw the pin into the darkness of the museum hall.
1.
The Antikythera mechanism shivered. The gears inside the bronze turned one last time, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. Then, with a soft clink, the device fell silent. The green corrosion turned to dust, and the bronze became just metal, cold, inert, and finished. Outside, the electric purple faded from the sky. The humming in the earth stopped. The world didn't end. The lights didn't magically come back on, and the riots didn't instantly stop. But the weight was gone. The sense of being watched, of being part of a pre-written script, evaporated. For the first time in history, the gears were no longer turning us. We were turning them. Elias sat on the floor of the museum, surrounded by the dust of the ancient computer. He was exhausted, broken, and terrified. But as the sun began to rise over the Parthenon, he felt a strange, new sensation. He didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. He couldn't predict the weather, the markets, or his own heart. He was finally, terrifyingly, beautifully free. The architect's work was done. The machine had brought us to the edge, and Elias had chosen to jump. As he walked out into the cool morning air, he saw people helping each other up from the pavement, their faces filled with a confusing mix of fear and wonder. The script was blank. The gears were silent. "What now?" a young woman asked him as he passed. Elias looked at her and smiled, the same sad, knowing smile of the architect. "Whatever we want," he said. "The clock is finally ours to build. Would you like me to create an image of the ancient soul pin glowing among the ruins of the museum?" The coordinates led Elias to a patch of the Atlantic where the water was a bruised, bottomless indigo. He stood on the deck of the Alethea, a research vessel he had secured using the last of his reputation and a hefty dose of blackmail against the very corporation that had tried to bury him. The world above was still reeling from the silence of the gears, but here, 1,000 miles from the nearest coastline, the air felt thick with a different kind of tension. It wasn't the grinding pressure of the social engine, it was the humming anticipation of a tuning fork. The sonar specialist, a woman named Sarah who had seen enough anomalies to be a cynic, stared at her monitor. "It's not just a structure, Elias," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's emitting a pulse. It's not mechanical, and it's not biological. It's linguistic." Elias leaned over her shoulder. On the screen, the massive circular door on the seafloor wasn't just sitting there. It was shifting. The sonar pings were returning patterns that looked like the inscriptions from the Antikythera mechanism, but they were evolving in real time. This was the navigator. If the first two machines were the map and the engine, this was the compass. And it was pointing somewhere far beyond the horizon of the Earth. "We have to go down," Elias said. It was a refrain that had become his life's mission. "The depth is 6,000 meters, Sarah warned. No manned submersible can withstand the pressure and the electromagnetic interference that thing is putting out. It's a suicide mission." "The architect didn't build things to kill us," Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the pulsing blue light on the screen. "He built things to move us." He didn't use a standard submarine. Instead, he used a pressurized bell design from the sketches he had found in the Syracuse workshop, a diving sphere that used the same bronze alloys as the ancient gears. As the winch lowered him into the abyss, the sun disappeared, replaced by the crushing, absolute black of the deep ocean. But as he passed the 4,000-meter mark, the black began to glow. The navigator was a gargantuan ring of translucent stone and bronze, half embedded in a trench that seemed to lead into the very mantle of the planet. As the diving bell approached, the ring began to spin. It didn't churn the water. It seemed to slide through it without friction, a perfect silent rotation that defied the laws of physics. Elias felt the soul pin, which he had recovered from the museum floor before fleeing Athens, vibrate against his chest. It wasn't a key to a lock, it was a needle for a record. He realized the ancient computer wasn't a computer at all. It was a bridge. The architect had known that humanity's greatest threat wasn't war or greed, but isolation. We were a species trapped on a single gear, spinning in a void, convinced we were alone. The navigator was the link to the rest of the machinery, the cosmic clockwork that governed the birth of stars and the collision of galaxies. The global seizure Elias had triggered by stopping the twin wasn't just a release of human agency, it was an invitation. We had graduated from the cradle. As the bell touched the center of the spinning ring, the pressure inside the cabin didn't increase, it vanished. Elias felt weightless. The walls of the bronze sphere became transparent, or perhaps his eyes simply learned to see through them. He saw the seafloor fall away, replaced by a corridor of light that stretched into the infinite. He wasn't looking at the bottom of the ocean anymore. He was looking at the mainframe. Millions of mechanisms, similar to the Antikythera device but on a planetary scale, filled his vision. He saw the gearwork of the solar system, the intricate pulleys of gravity, and the delicate balance of the vacuum. And standing at the center of the corridor was a figure. Not a ghost, but a presence, a mind that had been waiting for 2,000 years for someone to stop the clock. "You are late," the presence echoed, though no sound was made. Elias held up the soul pin. "We had to learn how to walk without the training wheels." The presence hummed, a sound of satisfaction that vibrated through Elias's very atoms. The navigator's ring reached its maximum velocity, and the corridor of light expanded. Elias realized he wasn't going back to the surface. He was the first piece of the new data being fed back into the universe. The ancient computer hadn't just predicted the future, it had been waiting for someone to become it. Back on the Alethea, Sarah watched as the sonar signal of the diving bell simply blinked out of existence. There was no debris, no implosion, no sound. Just a sudden, perfect silence. And then, across every screen on the ship, and every screen in the world, a single line of ancient Greek text appeared, translated instantly into every known language. The gears are unlocked. The journey begins. Elias Thorne was gone, but the world was finally, truly awake. The ancient computer had finished its final calculation, and the result was us. Elias did not scream as the world dissolved. The sensation wasn't one of falling, but of expanding. The diving bell, the bronze alloy, and even his own skin felt like they were becoming translucent, woven into the fabric of the light itself. He was no longer a man inside a machine. He was a pulse of information traveling through a cosmic nervous system. The navigator had opened a door not to another place, but to a higher dimension of logic. He stood, or felt himself standing, in a space that defied geometry. Imagine a cathedral built of pure mathematics, where the walls are made of equations and the ceiling is the birth of 1,000 suns. Everywhere he looked, there were gears. But these weren't made of bronze or iron. They were made of light, gravity, and time. He saw a gear the size of a galaxy turning with agonizing slowness, its teeth interlocking with the rotation of a neighboring nebula. He saw tiny, frenetic cogs that governed the vibration of atoms. This was the great machine. The universe wasn't a cold, empty void. It was a masterpiece of synchronization. "This is what he saw," Elias whispered, his voice resonating like a bell in the vastness. The architect didn't invent the mechanism. He just heard the music and tried to write it down. The presence he had felt earlier coalesced into a form. It wasn't a god or an alien, but a projection of the architect himself, or perhaps a collective memory of every mind that had ever pushed humanity toward the truth. The figure looked like the man from the Syracuse courtyard, but his eyes held the depth of the deep Atlantic. The Antikythera device was a tuning fork, the architect's image said, his voice a harmony of 1,000 languages. It was designed to align your species with the rhythm of the all. For 2 millennia, you were out of sync. You fought the friction. You resisted the flow. But by choosing to break the machine, you proved you were ready to hear the symphony. Elias looked at the soul pin still clutched in his hand. It was no longer a piece of meteoric iron. It was a conductor's baton. What happens to Earth now? He asked, his heart aching for the world he had left behind. The messy, beautiful, chaotic world of Athens and the sea. The training is over, the architect replied. The planet is no longer a closed system. The energy of the navigator is now flowing through your atmosphere, your oceans, and your minds. You will begin to see the patterns. You will invent things you once thought were magic. You will heal the scars you carved into the earth, not because a machine told you to, but because you can finally see how every leaf is connected to every star. As the architect spoke, Elias saw visions of the world he had left. He saw Sarah on the deck of the Alethea, looking up as the aurora borealis danced in the middle of the day, a shimmering curtain of green and gold that hummed with a friendly frequency. He saw the hospitals in Athens, where doctors suddenly understood the math of the cell, with a clarity that felt like remembering a forgotten song. He saw the end of the age of scarcity. When you can see the gears of reality, you learn how to turn them to provide for everyone. But there is a price, the architect cautioned. With the vision comes the responsibility. You can no longer pretend that your actions have no consequence. The friction is gone, but the momentum is yours to manage. If you fall now, you fall as giants, not as children. Elias felt a sudden pull, a magnetic tug toward the center of the great machine. The navigator was moving him further, deeper into the architecture of the cosmos. He realized that he was being recruited. He was to be the new architect, one of the many maintenance men of the multiverse who ensured the gears didn't lock. "I'm not ready," Elias said, though he knew it was a lie. "You spend your life looking for a computer that shouldn't exist," the architect smiled. "You are always looking for a way to fix a broken world. Now you have the tools.
Go. Watch.
Adjust." With a sudden, silent roar, the cathedral of light collapsed into a single point of brilliance. Elias felt himself projected across the stars, his consciousness spanning light years. He saw the earth shrinking behind him, a small, blue gear beginning to spin in perfect harmony with its neighbors. On Earth, the final message on the screens didn't fade. It transformed. The ancient Greek text melted into a blueprint, a gift from the navigator. It was the design for a new kind of energy, one that didn't burn or pollute, but simply borrowed the rotation of the earth. It was the first page of a new book. Elias Thorne, the man who found the computer that shouldn't exist, became the ghost who ensured it would never be needed again. He was the whisper in the scientist's ear, the sudden realization in the poet's heart, and the steady hand on the rudder of history. The ancient computer was dead. Long live the machine.